Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping people take their leadership to the next level. Brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International.
Well, Richard, it's good to be with you, as always.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you don't sound so hot there.
No, I've actually got a cold today. It's I got back from Nigeria not long ago and was so proud of myself. I hit the ground running, and but something came back with me, I think, and it caught up to me. That's the problem when you slow down. Then I hardly ever get sick when I'm going 90 miles an hour. But
yeah, that stinking immune system. It just,
oh boy,
it takes any chance it'll get, any slack you leave, it'll hop on there. And
so hopefully it's our listeners today can hear through the stuff nose.
We'll try and muscle through this on their behalf. So, well, today we're talking about one of those maybe unsavory topics of leadership.
Yeah.
The topic of criticism.
Yeah, one of those inevitable things. If you're leading, you will always experience at some point, and yet it's we know that, and yet sometimes it can certainly wear us down. I've known some folks that, boy, I tell you, they were great leaders. They were having enormous success, and basically a handful of critics derailed them, got them sidetracked, got them defensive, made them miserable. I knew a guy that had grown a church from a couple hundred to over 1,000, and probably critics you could count on the fingers of one hand drove him away. And I always kind of think, well, you've got 995 people that love you and appreciate you, but 5 critics drove you away. But that's the nature of criticism. It has a way of kind of getting under our skin and derailing even some of the best leaders.
Yeah. So why do you think people would even criticize
leaders? Well, in one sense, it seems kind of crazy because oftentimes what they're criticizing is growth, change. They're criticizing leadership. You'd think, hey, they ought to be happy that someone's leading, that this organization's moving forward.
But, you just got to speak the truth, though.
Yeah, and so I think there's a number of reasons why people criticize. I think it's probably important to take a moment just to recognize that there is a reason.
Right.
There is a motivation that causes people to criticize oftentimes very good leaders. One is just because leadership involves change. And as we've seen before, people are just naturally resistant to change, even if things are bad. It's amazing. I mean, things can be, a church, for instance, or a business could be declining and in very bad shape, and you'd think any change would be welcomed because we're headed toward bankruptcy and closure at this point. And yet, even when things are in dire condition, you try to change something, and there'll be those who want to debate it and argue about it and say that's not the right change for this situation. And so, change certainly creates opposition. You can count on that. You try to change something, there will be those who will criticize, even when it's obvious that change needs to take place.
Yeah.
The second reason some people can criticize is because they're a competitor of yours. They want their way to be done, not your way. And your success means their failure, at least in their eyes. So they don't want you to be too successful because maybe they want to be the dominant voice in the organization and they want their way, and maybe they want your job. And so the more success you have, the less likely it is that they're going to ever get to sit in your seat. So there are those who will just dog you all the time, and sometimes literally just trying to hound you out of the job, just wear you out till you leave, and then they can be in charge. Maybe they're a VP, and if the CEO gets run out, maybe they'll be the one asked to be the CEO next. Or I've known oftentimes lay people in churches that really wanted to be the pastor themselves, and especially in smaller churches. And so I've known churches where the dominant layman drove off 5 or 6 pastors, and each time the pastor left, they took over and ran things and even did the preaching. And then ultimately they called another pastor, and that person got driven off as well. So sometimes they have their own agenda. That's why they're criticizing. It's really not about really anything to do with the quality of what you're doing or changing. It's just they want your job. They don't want you to look good. And along with that is jealousy. It kind of goes hand in hand. When you're successful, I know people that, for instance, maybe in their area, they're not having success. And so for you to change something or to lead well and have success, that exposes the fact they're not having success. And so if they're going to have a miserable experience in their own leadership, then they want you to have one too. So there are some people literally that just envy people. It's almost as if they feel like, well, everybody ought to have some criticism, and you seem to be the golden boy that everything's working out for, so I'll just be your self-appointed critic so that it's not too easy for you. And maybe the last reason just to point out is that Satan just does not want, especially God's people, to succeed, and especially if they're doing God's work, particularly in the church, but also Christians just being successful in the business world. There is an enemy, and sometimes it has nothing to do with you or how you're leading. It's that you have an enemy who hates you and wants you to fail. And sometimes I've seen criticism and opposition that didn't even make sense. It wasn't even rational. But you realize, well, yeah, it's not rational because it's motivated by evil. And there's evil out there that will just strive to bring you down just because you're bringing glory to God when you do your job well and you reflect well on God. And so there'll be those who will just oppose you and criticize you, try to tear you down and bring out the worst in you. And we need to be aware that we're in a spiritual warfare. Oftentimes that's expressed through criticism.
Yeah, and so, thinking about how people criticize and the reasons they do, and I think one thing that comes to mind too is there are just critical people.
Yeah. That's another great one.
And so how would you differentiate, like when you're leading something and trying to parse out, well, how much of this is legitimate or jealousy based, and how much of this is just that person's critical, and I know no matter what I do, they're going to have the devil's, they're going to be the devil's advocate or whatever.
They criticize everybody. And well, that's a good question. And there's a number of things I think that you need to do in response to criticism. When someone criticizes you, I think there's a number of ways you need to respond to that. And of course, not all criticism is the same. It's motivated by different things. You need to understand, why is this happening? What's the motivation behind it? And so a couple of things I'd say in terms of that. One is just don't be surprised by it. If a leader should never be surprised when they're criticized. If you are, you just don't understand leadership. You will be criticized. It's just a matter of time. And it doesn't matter how well things are going. We sometimes think, well, we'll be criticized if things are going poorly. But often some of my worst criticism has come after success. And that early on in my leadership, that really blindsided me because I thought, hey, I'm safe now. We just had the biggest attendance we've had in years. We just had a raging, success. And so I should be clear for a while. Yeah. And then slam. Someone that just feels like this is all too good. We're going to need to find something negative here. Can't all be perfect. So don't be surprised by it. But a second thing I would say is also don't take criticism personally. I've known some really wonderful Christian leaders who just took everything to heart and agonized over things. And when someone was upset with them, they assumed it must be their fault. What did I do? I must have come across poorly. I must have said something wrong. And there are times when I've known well-intentioned, good-hearted leaders who beat themselves up because they've been criticized. Well, something must be wrong. I must have done something wrong, or we take it very personally, and so perhaps you've come to a leadership position, you get criticized, and so you immediately get your feelings hurt, and you think, well, why am I working hard like this if I'm just going to get criticized? Or I just made a huge sacrifice for this organization, and this is all I get.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm going to be treated like that, then I'm out of here. And I've seen folks that it got under their skin. Of course, critics often, that's what they want to do. They want to get under your skin. Oftentimes, critics don't have nearly the same power that a leader has. They don't control the budget like the leader does. They don't have the staff like the leader. They don't have the platform. So all they can do is get under your skin and become an irritant. And if you let them get under your skin, if you take it personally, if you start to let it get in your head, then you've given them way more power than they actually have. They don't have real power. They just have kind of fake power, which is, if I can get in your head, I can get you starting to think about me all the time and getting upset about what I said and getting defensive and irritable, then I'm winning. And so I tell people, criticism comes with the job. It doesn't matter if it was you or 100 other leaders, they'd be criticizing them the same way. So it's not about you. So don't let it become about you. And so if you need to, just back off and say, hey, this is starting to get too personal for me. I'm a leader. This is just what happens when you lead. I need to keep it objective here and just deal with it the way it is, and not begin to wonder if I made a mistake or second guess all my leadership ability, or just get petty and feel sorry for myself and have a pity party because no one appreciates me. You've got to learn to kind of suck it up as a leader and say that's what happens when you lead.
Right. Well, I know you've got a couple of more there, but let's take a quick break here, and then we'll come back and look at some more ways that we can handle criticism.
Ready to take your leadership to the next level? The Entrepreneurial Leaders Program is a 1-week intensive course at Oxford University designed to help marketplace and entrepreneurial leaders develop the skills they need to have a greater impact on their business and community. Don't miss this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study under Dr. Richard Blackaby and other leadership experts at one of the world's most prestigious academic institutions. This transformational course will run from August 11th through 19th, 2019. For more information or to register, visit entrepreneurialleaders.com. The link will be in the show notes.
So, Richard, it's difficult for anyone to face down criticism as a leader, and that we certainly have a negativity bias. Those critics kind of stick with us longer than those who praise us. So what are some other takeaways that we can have when we inevitably, as we lead, face criticism?
Well, there's a number of things I think we can do. We mentioned a couple, but I would also say, there is a common adage that says there's always a kernel of truth in every criticism.
Yeah.
And, it may be exaggerated and overblown, but if you dig down to the core, you'll probably find that, well, okay, they exaggerated this or they overgeneralized, but you do tend to do this sometimes, and you can make an adjustment. But I would push back and say there is a kernel of truth. There's often some source from which these critics are jumping on and then exaggerating, perhaps. But sometimes there isn't. Sometimes these people are just jerks. Sometimes they're just negative people, and they're hostile towards you. And I've known some really good-hearted leaders who beat themselves up trying desperately to find what that kernel of truth was. And they couldn't find it because it wasn't there. And so, whenever, if you're criticized, I would always say, well, do examine, you do take a moment and reflect and say, is there truth here? But you may not find any truth, and that may be because there isn't any truth. This just may be outright evil. And now you're navel gazing, looking for that kernel of truth when there is no kernel of truth. So always take it seriously, always take a moment and reflect and do an honest accounting. But it may well be that this is completely fabricated criticism, and if that's the case, then treat it that way and move forward. Let it go.
Yeah, that can be incredibly liberating for people.
Yeah,
to realize that some of the critics and some of the criticizing of your leadership, it may just simply be people who don't like you.
Yeah,
and so
and they may be just for no other reason that you hold the job they want, And so, nothing that you've done, so you've got to take a hard look at that. I'd say also you need to keep your heart right, because nothing will expose flaws and cracks in your Christian life and trust in God than criticism. That it's like criticism is kind of like putting fire underneath you to find out just how pure you actually are. Everybody can look pretty pious and Christian when everything's going well and you're being praised, but criticism has a way of peeling away a lot of the surface kind of facade, and you realize, is this guy really a loving person? I mean, when everyone is nice to him, he seems very loving. But when he's getting criticized, is he still humble? Is he still loving? Is he still kind? And so criticism sometimes exposes what our heart condition is really like. And so really work hard to have your heart pure so that you don't get into a pity party. You don't get angry. You don't start slinging mud back at people that criticize you. A couple other things I would say, and we touched on this earlier, but when you are criticized, consider the source.
Yeah.
And I think that's crucial. Now, there are some people that I know are my friends, and I know that they've been there for me, and I know they've spoken words of life into me, and that 99% of the time when I'm talking to them, they're affirming and encouraging. So when all of a sudden they say, Richard, have you thought about this? Or I'm kind of concerned about that. Boy, I listen to them because I know they love me. I know they're my friend.
Yeah.
And I know that they don't just every time they see me criticize me. So I want to take that seriously. But, there may be someone who is chronically negative. I mean, everything that they ever talk about, there's something wrong with it. They may pride themselves in finding the one thing that's wrong with people and programs. If that's the case, then I also have to take that into account. And, there are people that like to criticize others, but they don't have any successful track record themselves. It's like, well, how do I take you seriously? You don't even run your own department well, but you want to criticize mine. Or maybe your own personal life is a total disaster. Your health, your finances, your personal life, your relationships, everything in your life is a disaster. And so how do I take seriously when you start to point out things in my life? You have to be careful with that because they still could be pointing out truth. But I tell you what, when people really have their own act together and they're dealing with issues themselves, then when they suggest I need to deal with an issue, I take that more seriously because I realize they're walking their talk. They address their issues, and now they're pointing out an issue that they think I need to address. Well, hey, if they're doing it, then maybe I need to listen as well. And then also just, are these people experts? And again, some people can still stumble upon truth about me that I need to address. But there are some people that really know what they're talking about and others that don't.
Yeah.
And I've had people that they have no idea what I do in my work. They have no idea the challenges I face, but they just have suggestions how from sitting out in the audience, they can tell that I should do this better or that better. I'll listen to them, but, at the same time, there are times where I'll just realize they don't really know what they're talking about. And
yeah, I think it's easy to sit in an audience and say, hey, well, here's some points on, how you could present better, or, maybe let me give you this encouragement on how to talk to large audiences or something, when they themselves have, they maybe have never done that. So,
and I've had that happen where, and not again to say that I don't have room to improve, but someone is sitting in the audience, and I speak for a living. I travel around the world speaking, and I've got people coming up that don't speak anywhere who have suggestions how I could improve. And maybe it's true, as a listener, maybe they did pick something up. But I'll tell you what, if they are a well-known speaker themselves and they have a full calendar of invitations because they obviously know what they're talking about, I tend to listen and take that even more seriously because obviously they're an expert in the subject. They've studied it. They've worked on it themselves. So, you weigh the critics. They sometimes a critic can stumble upon something that's true,
right.
But nonetheless, there's some that just automatically carry more weight with me because I just take them seriously. And I think sometimes you need to just not take critics seriously. That's a great response sometimes, is just don't take them seriously. And that's really another thing just to point out is you have to consider, do I even need to respond? I know some people that they don't have an audience. No one listens to them. No one takes them seriously. So when they criticize you, what they desperately want is an audience. If you've ever answered a critic on Twitter or Facebook, you know what
the
what
comment
happens.
section is a great place.
Then they have like 3 followers themselves, and so they take on someone that has thousands of followers, and no one would care if all they did was just tweet to their 3 followers. It's their mother and their brother and their wife, and so no one cares what they think. But if they can engage you in a running battle, all of a sudden now all of your followers are listening to what they have to say. And so I found sometimes the single best thing to do with critics is just isolate them, just ignore them. And that drives critics crazy because they want an audience. They want to be listened to. And I've said this before, it's just been kind of my experience, is that there are some people who have nothing really positive to say themselves. And so what they want to do is just have a ministry of criticizing others. But if no one listens to their criticism, then they're muted. And so sometimes the best thing to do with a critic is simply ignore them. And that could be devastating to them. But sometimes, if this critic works for you, if they're an employee or if they're a member of your church, sometimes sometimes ignoring them will just silence them and isolate them and put them in a place where they just have no credibility. But sometimes they're like a poison. They're like a cancer. They're just a steady negative voice that begins to sour a whole culture. And, all it takes is 1 or 2 negative critical people in a meeting to turn the whole meeting south and make it a bad experience. We were having a very positive meeting. Everyone was real excited and pumped up, and then this person began to spew all the negativity, and now everything has gone quiet, and the enthusiasm has left the room. And so, one critic keeps looking for someone else, and now they've got 2 or 3 of them. They're growing. Still a vast minority, but it's some good people are getting sucked into this negativity. And so sometimes I realize that as a leader, you've got to confront it. You've got to have a face-to-face. You've got to challenge it. Sometimes you just got to come right out and just publicly say, this isn't true. This is false. This is a lie. And sometimes I think even you've got to, if you've got someone on your team that is just a chronically negative, critical person, you may want to get them off your team. It's one thing to have people who just speak the truth and challenge presuppositions. It never hurts to have some people who have a different perspective. But if they just feel it's their job that no matter what you take on, they're going to criticize it, then I think sometimes as a leader, you owe it to just the rest of the team to remove those negative voices. That they're not. It's not necessarily based on genuine conviction. It's just that they're a negative person. There's a great story. John Rockefeller, of course, was a brilliant businessman. At one point, he was walking along a sidewalk with one of his associates, and Rockefeller had been criticized. And his associate was saying, Mr. Rockefeller, don't you think you should respond to that? Don't you think you should refute what's being said? And just then he saw a worm slithering across the sidewalk. And Rockefeller pointed to the worm and he said, do you see that? He said, when I stop and give my attention to it, I've just wasted my time giving attention to a worm. He said, but if I ignore it, it'll disappear. And pretty old burn kind of moment, but and I mean that can sound kind of pretty arrogant in one sense, but what I've often found is that when you sort of, it's like a fire. If you don't give it oxygen, it just goes out. And sometimes when critics, the critics are looking for a fight. I mean, they want someone to argue with. They want someone to debate with. And if you just are unwilling to get in the ring and let them flail away at you, they move on, or they people just turn their attention away, and they no longer have an audience. The last thing I would just say as far as criticism is, there's a great verse in 1 Peter 5:7. It says, casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And there's times where you just need to trust in God's affirmation of your leadership at a certain point. There's some great verses as well that talks about God being our shield. And there's times where you just need to let him defend you, because you can, like Rockefeller understood, you can end up, when you put your focus on possibilities and opportunities, you can have some incredible success and growth. But if you start to get distracted and you start spending all of your energy and focus on answering your critics, then your productivity is going to decline. Yeah. And you're never going to get ahead by just spending all of your energy facing your critics. They will always be a distraction. Sometimes you just have to deal with the distraction because it is beginning to affect the whole organization. But just know you're never going to be like increasing sales by chasing after critics. Right. You're not going to be expanding the church by answering critics all day. Right. So whenever there are times you have to, just part of the messy part of leadership, sometimes you may have to get in the ring and kind of silence this critic once and for all. But just understand you're not advancing when you do that. You're taking care of business sometimes, but you're not moving forward. And so as quickly as you can change your focus away from the critics and get on to productivity and work and possibilities, the better. And so don't let critics set the agenda for your leadership. You'll end up with a very negative, responsive leadership where you're not being proactive. Now you're having to react to what all your critics are saying, and now they're in the driver's seat, not you. And so by getting pulled into the ring, you're no longer in charge anymore. You're just responding to what critics are flinging at you, and that's a very unhealthy way to lead.
Well, I think that's a great word to lead on, not letting critics set the agenda for your leadership. So thank you very much.
Good.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, review us on Apple Podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. If you have questions or comments, please email us at podcast@blackaby.org.